What dark family secret have you uncovered? Story 1. My great-great-grandfather owed a gambling debt to his former best friend. Apparently, after a night of gambling in which my ancestor somehow wronged his best friend, a gunfight broke out at my grandfather's house. His best friend pulled a shotgun on him but missed and hit his own wife, who was visiting my grandfather's wife at the time. My grandfather was struck in the neck by a single buckshot pellet that remained lodged there for the rest of his life. Several months later, my great-great-grandfather disappeared. After a manhunt, a body was found cut into 3 parts on the railroad tracks. The head was missing, but whoever found the body brought back the 6-shooter and whiskey flask from the scene, and my great-great-grandmother confirmed them to be her husband's. Now for the big twist. It was rumored that my grandfather had another family in a different state, where he would often vanish for long periods. The head of the body on the tracks was never found. Family legend has it that my ancestor killed a man and planted his own belongings on the body, disposing of the head so it could never be identified. In doing so, he erased his debts and blood feud and went on living with his other family. Rest in peace, great-great-grandpa Charles, you awful man. Story 2. My mother once told me a story about attending a small funeral in the late 1950s in East Texas. The deceased was a mentally challenged child, and the family was relieved that the child was finally at peace. During the service, the coffin began to rock, and crying could be heard. Then my mother was taken outside as the coffin was carried to the nearby cemetery and hastily buried. Years later, I was telling this story to my kids when my mother walked into the room, listened for a moment, and asked, "Are you telling them about Uncle Chucky?" What? She had never mentioned that part before. Story 3. It is not exactly dark, but my great-uncle on my father's side was widely considered a fool. My dad's family were recent immigrants from Italy, and I suppose my great-uncle decided he wanted to visit his homeland. He was born there but raised in America. Unfortunately, he was completely oblivious to world events because he went to Italy in 1938. He ended up getting drafted into the Italian military since he was born there. He did not realize that he did not have to serve, as the United States would have contested it if he had contacted the embassy. Luckily, he was only assigned to patrol duties within Italy, and Italy surrendered and turned on Mussolini before the Allies advanced far enough to encounter him. It was all very awkward since my grandfather and his other brothers had served in the United States military and fought in Europe. Story 4. I have been researching my ancestry recently and became quite confused when I stumbled upon one of my grandmother's birth certificates, which listed a female in the father section. It turns out my great-grandmother, who lived in a large port city in her youth, became pregnant by a foreign sailor who was never heard from again. At that time, a mother could not register a newborn with the authorities. It had to be done by her husband or another guardian. So her aunt, whom she lived with, went to the authorities to complete the paperwork and had to put her own name in the father section. Story 5. There is a long line of abuse in my family on my dad's side. I do not know all the details, but from what I have gathered, my great-grandfather was possibly surely abusive toward my dad. He was also abusive to his wife and daughter, my grandmother. No one talks about it directly since he died several years ago, but there is always a lingering tone of disgust when he is mentioned. My once cheerful grandfather, who is now a kind man, was definitely abusive toward my dad as well. Unfortunately, this led to my dad becoming deeply damaged and abusive toward my mom. Thankfully, he never hurt my sister or me. He wanted to end the cycle of abuse against children, but it did not extend to his spouse. My mom eventually divorced him. He went to therapy and is doing much better now. I refuse to continue the cycle. It is not easy, and I have anger issues too. But there is no way I will ever let my son have a childhood like his predecessors. Story 6. My great-grandparents were first cousins. They had 2 sons who were severely intellectually disabled, and instead of putting them in an institution, which was common practice at the time, my great-grandparents bought a farm in the countryside and kept them at home. Both sons died fairly young. My grandmother never mentioned any of this, and I only discovered it after she passed away while doing genealogical research. My maternal grandmother also had a stillborn son. She once told me about giving birth to him. I was her caregiver during her final year, and how they buried him at the feet of a single woman who had died. My mother and her siblings knew nothing about this. She also had 2 miscarriages, meaning she had 8 pregnancies and 5 children. Story 7. When I was in the military, I found out my grandpa was on his deathbed. I jumped through several hoops to take a week of emergency leave so I could make it to his funeral and support my dad through the ordeal. I spent the week helping the family out. 2 days before the funeral, I learned that my grandpa had been a violent pedophile who had sexually assaulted several of my cousins and had even attempted to assault my sister. Most of my family knew about the rumors, but not that he had gone after her. Everyone still went to the funeral, pretending it was to support my grandma, even though she was in denial and claimed the kids had made it up. I cannot look at her the same way anymore, and even though I love my family deeply, I do not understand how they can act as if this never happened. I left the morning of the funeral. That man died far too peacefully, and I hope someone waters the flowers on his grave with their urine. Story 8. My grandfather may have been a war criminal. He was born in the United Kingdom to a German family and spent part of his childhood in Germany. For the rest of his life, he could easily fool Germans into thinking he was one of them, then switch back to Yorkshire English just as convincingly. He never told us much about the war. We knew he was a special weapons expert and that he was recalled by the army for consultations well into the 1980s. But some of the stories he told sounded like something straight out of the film Inglourious Basterds. I am fairly sure he spent several days as part of an Afrika Korps support battalion, secretly sabotaging it from within before escaping at night in a half-track with their last working weapons. We know for certain that on at least one occasion, he drove a lorry into a Wehrmacht arms depot to deliver shells and bullets that would not function, making sure the real ammunition was on another truck that would never be found to arrive. He served in the British Army throughout the war, but based on what we have pieced together, much of what he did seems to have violated the Geneva Convention, which explicitly forbids wearing enemy uniforms on the battlefield. Story 9. My great-aunt and uncle were the kindest people imaginable. When I was growing up, they lived 4 houses down, so I often went to their place after school. My Uncle Jimmy would play dolls and have tea parties with me, and I have very fond memories of both of them. When my Uncle Jimmy died, I remember seeing all these very professional-looking older men at his funeral, surrounded by what seemed like security guards. Many years later, my mom casually mentioned that my Uncle Jimmy had been an old-fashioned English gangster. He had done time for robbery and trafficking and was accused of murdering 4 people, though there was never enough evidence to prosecute. I was shocked. To make it even more unbelievable, my sweet Auntie Diane, his wife, had been the madam at one of his brothels and was responsible for recruiting the women he exploited. She had also served time. I eventually realized that those men at the funeral were likely old gangsters, and the thought of it completely unsettled me. Story 10. My great-grandfather was a bootlegger and allegedly a cannibal during the Great Depression. I say allegedly because his friends claimed it was a rumor he started himself to keep people from messing with his family. However, they could never disprove it, since even up until his death he swore he had eaten a rival's liver. I should note that he was Native American, which earned him the nickname Wen, short for Wendigo. My grandpa always said it was all an act because Wen often had to fight for things like milk and even threatened power company workers to stop them from shutting off the electricity. I have no idea how much of the story is true, as it seemed to get more exaggerated with every retelling, right up until my grandpa's death. Story 11. My ancestors are from northern India. Before the Indian partition, our family was spread across what are now Pakistan, Himachal Pradesh, and Kashmir. I have 118 second cousins on my dad's side. He himself has 55 cousins, but only 16 second cousins on my mom's side. I later discovered the reason for this difference. Most of my grandmother's family had been massacred during partition. They lived in what is now Pakistan and did not make it across the border in time. She has always refused to tell us how she escaped or how she ended up in India. Eventually, she found her elder brother, who lived in Himachal Pradesh, and stayed with him. On my maternal grandfather's side, many of his cousins died from disease. I am also fairly certain that one of my great aunts was a Muslim woman who was forced into marriage as an act of revenge. People in my grandfather's family were also killed during partition. There is a great deal of bloodshed in both family lines. We live in the United States now, but I remain deeply fascinated by these stories. Story 12. I always knew my grandmother had my oldest uncle out of wedlock with someone else, and that she was already pregnant a second time when she married my grandfather. He must have been a brave man to take on another man's child in the 1930s. Years later, after my parents had passed away, I started doing some family history research and looked at my uncle's birth date and my grandmother's birth date. She would have been 14 or 15. The supposed father was said to be a wealthy man who took advantage of her while she worked in his mansion, supposedly. I never found out the full truth about her and my grandfather. When you looked at that sweet little old lady, you could never imagine her going through something like that. Even in the few photos we have of her as a young woman, it is hard to picture. And now, I suppose I will never know. Story 13. I had always heard stories about my great-aunt being blind, but I had never actually met her. When I finally did, I noticed the scars on her temple, and after she left, I asked my grandpa, her brother, about them. When she was young, the town she lived in was being terrorized by a serial rapist. Her husband worked at the gun store that my grandpa managed. One night, her husband said he was going out and told her to lock the door because of the rapist. She did, and a few hours later, she saw in the news that the serial rapist had been cornered in a house and was holding a woman and her daughter hostage while trying to negotiate with the police. When he leaned out the window holding the little girl and yelling something at the officers, she recognized him. It was her husband. She went upstairs, grabbed his gun, and shot herself in the head. I have no idea what happened to him afterward, and I never asked. He is probably dead or in prison. Story 14. My grandfather made a series of strange and poor choices throughout his teaching career. He left a well-paying job in an affluent school district to move his family across the country to teach at a Christian high school, which failed completely. Later, he quit his full-time professorship at a local Christian college to teach high school chemistry, just as his children were about to attend that same college, losing them the chance at free tuition. It seemed like yet another foolish move in a lifetime filled with bad decisions and failed get-rich-quick schemes. That was until I started college there and got a job in a department where part of my work involved organizing old employee records. Any professor who had ever been officially hired had their file permanently archived. I found my grandfather's file, even though he had been dead for 2 years. On top of the file was a letter from the 1990s explaining that he had been cleared to return as an adjunct and had made repentance to his wife, showing remorse for his actions 20 years earlier, the actions that had led to his dismissal. My grandfather hadn't left a good job to chase a new opportunity. He had been fired because, as a married man with 4 teenage children, he had an inappropriate relationship with an undergraduate student. To this day, only my mother and I know the truth. Story 15. I doubt anyone knows exactly who I am, so here it goes. My brother has a daughter that no one in our family ever knew about. About 10 years ago, I was preparing to move away from the college town where I had lived for a decade after graduating. During my going away party, I overheard one of my longtime local friends talking about how she had once cared for a young woman in her early 20s who was dying of cancer. I said, "That's strange. That sounds like my brother's ex-girlfriend." She suddenly looked shocked and asked, "You're his brother?" As if it had just occurred to her after all these years. When I confirmed it, she told me that yes, it was his ex, the same woman she had cared for. Then she asked how my brother was doing. I said he was great, that he had just gotten married and had his first child. She paused and said, "That's not his first child." My jaw dropped. Apparently, my brother and his ex had spent a summer in Chicago during college, about 30 years ago, and had a baby they kept secret, giving it up for adoption. My brother has apparently been keeping tabs on his daughter ever since, but never told anyone. Then they broke up, the ex got cancer and died, and now I finally understand why my brother drank so heavily for a few years afterward. Story 16. I learned that my grandfather murdered my grandmother 3 months before I was born. He was a member of the Pritchard, Alabama, police department at the time, and managed to make her death look like a suic, collecting a large amount of insurance money afterward. The suic story might have been believable, except that when my aunt tried to investigate her mother's death, all the documents were court-sealed. My mother later told me that my grandmother had just gotten her driver's license and a new job, and had been excited about becoming a grandmother. It turns out she was planning to leave my grandfather. When I finally went through some of his old belongings after his death, I found photos of him posing with his Ku Klux Klan buddies. Also, in 1983, the year I was born, the Pritchard Police Department was at the height of its corruption, something that can still be confirmed through old newspaper records. No one in my family wants to talk about it, and the only surviving member of my father's side is my dad, but I no longer speak to him. Story 17. When I was around 12 years old, I learned something that completely changed how I viewed my parents. I found out that my dad had been married before he met my mom, that they had an affair, and that I was the result. I had always known they got married after I was born, when my mom was pregnant with my brother. There are 3 of us in total. But discovering that my mom had been the other woman and that I was a love child really floored me. I had grown up thinking they just fell in love and started a family in the normal way. My dad's first wife found out when my mom, heavily pregnant with me, went to visit him in the hospital while he was sick. I never learned what happened to that first wife. They didn't keep in touch after the divorce. But I've always felt bad for her. To be betrayed by your husband, replaced by a much younger woman, and then see that woman carry the child you couldn't have must have been unbearable. I still feel a strange sense of guilt about it, and I often wonder about that woman I never met. If she's still alive, I imagine she must have hated my parents, and maybe even resented me. I truly hope she was able to find love again and go on to live a happy life. Story 18. When I was a kid, my father went to Alabama to attend the funeral of my great-grandmother. I had only met her a few times as a child. She lived alone on a 15-acre plot of land in a ghost town called Repton. That land was part of a larger 100-acre property divided among her siblings, which itself had been divided and passed down through generations. She was also the last of our family to be buried in our private graveyard in that same town, with graves dating back to the early 1800s. Years later, my parents showed us a slideshow of old photos they had digitized from her house. Some of them showed my great-grandfather and his father working on a farm on the same land my great-grandmother had lived on. I asked, "Was that land always a farm?" My dad said, "Yes, your great-grandfather was the last one to work it. It used to be several hundred acres, but over time it was sold off or given to relatives." And that was how I learned that my family once owned a slave plantation in Alabama. Story 19. My grandmother once tried to end my mother's pregnancy using a coat hanger. She already had 6 kids, they were living in poverty, and this was long before birth control was common. Obviously it didn't work, and out of guilt, she made sure everyone knew my mom was her favorite. My mom didn't find out until my grandmother was on her deathbed and rambling. My grandmother had always been deeply religious and very vocal about being pro-life, so it came as a shock. I don't know if she became pro-life because of that experience, or if she was one of those only my abortion is justified people. But it was surprising. My mom has always remained pro-choice. In her words, Grandma had the right to make that choice. After it failed, she made another choice, to keep me instead of trying again. If I were dead, it's not like I'd care. Story 20. I live in the United States. My mother brought me here from Mexico when I was 3 months old. Growing up, I never knew what Mexico was like or what my extended family there was like. I am now 21, but back when I was in high school, my mom was on our home computer reading news from a major Mexican outlet when she called me over to look at something. On the screen was a photo of a man surrounded by police tape. "What is it, Mom?" I asked. She told me the man who had been killed was my uncle. I had always heard about random shootings and robberies happening in big Mexican cities, but this was different. My uncle had been part of a cartel and was shot about 9 times. That was when I learned why my father never came to the United States with us. My mom had left him because he had been running substances across Mexico in a semi-truck, hiding them in the trailer without her knowledge. When she discovered what he was doing, she left him and never saw him again. I've never met him either. It turns out my father has had multiple families over his lifetime. Not at the same time, but one after another. One day I received a friend request on Facebook from a young girl in Mexico. I asked my mom if she knew her, and she said no, but told me to accept it anyway. After I did, the girl messaged me, claiming to be my sister. She said my father had abandoned her and her mother. According to her, I have 11 siblings, including my full-blooded brother. Some of them live in the United States, while others are still in Mexico. I often think about how incredible it would be to meet them all someday, but it seems almost impossible. Story 21. My aunt had her first child when she was 14. She hid the pregnancy from her mother as long as she could before finally moving in with her boyfriend's family to escape her mom's anger. Against all odds, she and that boyfriend got married and are still together 30 years later. Both of her siblings, however, have been divorced and remarried. My other aunt wasn't my grandfather's biological child, but he loved her unconditionally and treated her exactly the same as his biological son, my dad. He endured years of emotional abuse from my grandmother just to make sure my aunt got the medical care she needed. She had polio and a serious heart condition as a child. I didn't learn about any of this until after they had both passed away. On a darker note, my wife's cousin was arrested for possession and distribution of child pornography. His father lied to everyone, saying it was just for illegal downloading and that he'd be out of jail within a year. When that year passed, we got curious, looked up his case online, and learned the truth. He's still serving time and won't be out for several more years. Story 22. When my dad was about 18, my grandfather had an affair with a woman from his theater group, a married woman. When the affair came to light, her husband shot her and then shot himself. She died, but he survived and later went on to live in the same town, working as a pharmacist with a new family. This all happened in the 1970s in Australia, where guns weren't exactly common even then. My grandmother, already struggling with severe depression, moved into a motel for a few weeks after the affair, but ultimately took her own life. My grandfather, the emotionally detached man that he was, sent my dad a letter while he was away at college, explaining that she had taken sleeping pills and died. According to my dad, aunt, and uncle, he's always acted as though none of it was his fault. He eventually remarried a cold woman who refuses to acknowledge his children or grandchildren. A few years ago, my aunt requested a copy of my grandmother's death certificate for legal reasons. The cause of death was listed as hanging. It turns out my grandfather had lied. He had come home to find her hanging under the porch. In a strange twist, my aunt later befriended the daughter of the woman her father had been having the affair with, finding some small sense of closure in the connection. Story 23. My mother died when I was only 1 year old. She and my father were never married, and after her death, I lost all contact with her side of the family. Only in recent years, after reconnecting with my sister who grew up in foster care, did I begin to understand how cursed my mother's family really was. My sister told me that after our mother died, my father wrote to my grandfather, the family patriarch, asking to take care of all 3 of her children. My grandfather refused. Instead, he decided that each child should go to their own father. Yeah, there were 3 of us, each with a different father. Actually, 4, but I'll get to that. My grandfather had been a German officer during World War II, not the kind who fought on the front lines, but one who lived comfortably in safety, high-ranking and wealthy. Like most Nazis of his time, he despised anyone who wasn't Aryan. In the late 1970s, my mother had a boyfriend who was Italian. That alone was unacceptable to my grandfather. When she got pregnant with my sister, she was forced to tell him. Furious that his daughter had not only gotten pregnant out of wedlock, but with a non-German man, he gave her an ultimatum. Either end the relationship and obey him completely or be disowned. My mother chose to stay, leaving her boyfriend behind. My grandfather quickly arranged a marriage for her. She was beautiful, and the man fell for her instantly. She convinced him that the baby was his, and for 2 years they lived what seemed like a stable life. But when she finally divorced him, she made sure to devastate him on the way out, telling him the child wasn't his and forbidding him from ever seeing her again. Not long after, my grandfather arranged another marriage. To secure the relationship, my mother became pregnant again, this time with my brother. That marriage also lasted only 2 years. Eventually, my mother met my father, divorced again, became pregnant with me, and planned to marry him. But she died suddenly from an asthma attack 2 days before Christmas. After her death, my siblings and I were separated. My sister was sent to live with the man who had raised her for 2 years, the one who already knew she wasn't his child. It didn't last. She developed childhood kleptomania, a response to the trauma and instability. He sent her to foster care, while my grandparents made an arrangement with the children's home. She would live there during the week and visit them on weekends. That's how she grew up. You might think it's just a tragic family story, but it gets worse. My father was furious at my grandfather for splitting us up and sending my sister to foster care. He cut off all contact. My grandfather, meanwhile, remained wealthy. He owned a construction company and vast estates. My uncle opened a large dental clinic in Hamburg, but he was deeply unstable. One day he faxed my grandfather a note saying he planned to kill himself. My grandfather drove 500 kilometers to reach him, only for my uncle to answer the door and claim his ex-wife had sent the message for revenge. My grandfather drove back home. Hours later, the police called to inform him that his son had taken his own life. That broke him. Weeks later, he supposedly fell from scaffolding at a construction site and died instantly. The only witnesses were his business partner and the partner's son, who claimed it was an accident. Conveniently, after his death, large sums of money went missing, and my grandmother never received a single cent from the multi-million Deutschmark company. To make things worse, the bank showed up soon after, informing my grandmother that their entire estate was now property of the bank. My uncle, the same one who had opened the clinic, had a severe gambling addiction. My grandfather had given him 500,000 Deutschmarks, a fortune at the time, as an investment, but he gambled it all away. When the debts mounted, my grandfather took loans against their property to bail him out. Eventually, my uncle began running from the Hamburg mob before taking his own life. My grandmother lost everything. My aunt, the widow of another uncle who had died of cancer, took her in. She's the one who told me most of these stories. Hearing them all made me realize that my mother's family wasn't just unfortunate, it was cursed. Story 24. I've shared this before, but I have an uncle I'll never meet and most likely another aunt somewhere in the United States. My grandmother was a horrible person. My mother didn't even know she had a third sister until she was in her early 30s, and she didn't know she had a brother until that same sister told her when they met for the first time. The reason my mother never knew about my Aunt T was because my grandmother literally gave her away on the courthouse steps. My Uncle R, whom I've never met and never will, was also given up. He doesn't hold any anger toward my mother or me, but he wants nothing to do with us. And honestly, I can't blame him for that. I found out more about my uncle and a possible fourth aunt on my 18th birthday, when my mother and I visited my grandmother's best friend. That was when I learned about all the awful things my grandmother had done. According to her best friend, my mom might have another sister, but no one knows where she is. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's and dementia, so she can't fill in the blanks. Not that she would have if she were still alive. I'm the only one out of my 4 cousins who knows any of this. Sometimes seeing my oldest cousin and her mother talk about how wonderful my grandma was makes me feel sick, because they have no idea what she was really like. And honestly, this story is just the beginning. My grandmother was an absolute disgrace of a human being. Story 25. My cousin started digging through Ancestry.com and discovered that my grandparents didn't actually get married until my dad was 8 and my uncle was 5. They had just pretended to be married all along. Then one weekend, they ran off and secretly tied the knot. Back then, it was a huge deal to have kids without being married, but honestly, I think it's kind of amazing. They were ahead of their time. They ended up being married for over 46 years, but together for nearly 60 before my grandmother passed away. Sometime later, the same cousin discovered through more research that my mom and dad had also secretly married over a year before their big church wedding. They always took vacations to celebrate the church wedding anniversary, but apparently they also celebrated their secret wedding anniversary quietly between just the two of them. My dad passed away suddenly this past August, 1 month shy of their 29th church wedding anniversary. Everyone who didn't know about the secret wedding felt sad that they hadn't quite made it to 30 years of marriage. But what they didn't know was that my parents had already celebrated their 30th anniversary together that June. Story 26. I recently learned that my dad had tried to take his own life when he was a young man. He was a star student, top of his class at a military academy, until he suffered a traumatic brain injury during a boxing match that wasn't properly treated. His grades dropped, and he struggled for the rest of his time at the academy, barely graduating near the bottom of his class. Since then, he's had lifelong trouble focusing on anything anyone says to him. Growing up, I had to repeat every single thing I ever said to him, to the point where it became instinctive. Later in life, I actually had to train myself not to automatically repeat things in conversations with other people. The depression my father developed afterward was treated successfully with medication, but the effects of that brain injury stayed with him for the rest of his life. Story 27. You really do find out the wildest things at funerals. When my dad died, we learned that he and my mom had run off to Tijuana to get married, only to discover months later that marriages performed there weren't legally recognized in the United States. So they had to go to the courthouse in San Diego and get married all over again. We also found out that my dad's parents had divorced back in the 1960s and stayed divorced for 10 years before remarrying. The crazy part? They never lived apart, which is why none of us grandkids ever knew. Then, at my other grandfather's funeral, we learned that he used to visit prostitutes while working at sea, mostly in Panama and Central America. My mom was devastated when she found out, but honestly, I had always suspected something like that, since he would be gone for months at a time, far from his wife. We also learned that he was a mean drunk who used to abuse his 3 younger kids. It was heartbreaking because that grandfather was my favorite. Our relationship had felt like something out of a wholesome TV show. It's been hard to reconcile the loving, doting grandpa I knew with the man who had once been so cruel to his own children. Story 28. This is a throwaway account because of how unbelievable this might sound, but it's true. I come from an ancient family whose pre-11th century history is mostly lost. What's known is that my ancestors were powerful, wealthy, and of royal descent. At least 14 kings and queens appear in the surviving records. In the 15th century, around the year 1496, my 11th great-grandfather, King P, forged a major alliance with the Spanish monarchy. After converting to Catholicism around 1494, he conspired with the conquistadors in the overthrow of his own kingdom. For his cooperation, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand rewarded him with the noble title of Marquis, and he returned to rule over what remained of his homeland. In 1562, his son, my 10th great-grandfather, was a wealthy merchant who entered into a business agreement with the Earl of Ponte and the notorious English privateer John Hawkins, who would later become Admiral Sir John Hawkins under Queen Elizabeth I. The Earl supplied Hawkins with goods which he then traded in Sierra Leone for enslaved Africans, the first to be transported to the Americas, specifically to Hispaniola. In short, my family was directly involved in the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest and most horrific systems of human suffering in history. The thought that my bloodline helped establish such an atrocity is something I still struggle to come to terms with. Story 29. At my grandfather's wake and funeral in 1996 or 1997, the place was packed, not just with family, but with about 20 FBI agents. It turned out my grandfather and his brother had once been the heads of the Irish mob in Jersey City and New York between the 1930s and 1950s. Pretty much everyone there had been involved in something shady, illegal deals, violence, or unsolved murders. My great-uncle in particular was said to be responsible for killing at least 8 members of the rival Italian mob during a bloody turf war. According to the FBI, he had a habit of knocking out his enemies, stuffing them into suitcases, and tossing them off the Bayonne Bridge while they were still alive. The FBI agents were there just in case my grandfather's brother decided to show up, though no one had seen or heard from him since the early 1960s. The night went on. The agents eventually left, and my father introduced me to a man named John. He said he hadn't seen him in ages, and that John had been a good friend of my grandfather's. John shook my hand, told a few funny stories about my dad and grandpa, then slipped out quietly before the night ended. Years later, I asked my father if John had actually been his uncle, the one the FBI had been looking for. He just said, "Yep." Apparently, he'd been living under an alias in South Carolina, had a whole new family, and died years later. By then, there was nothing the FBI could do about it. Story 30. When I was a kid, my grandfather always seemed a little mysterious. I'd tell him about movies like Toy Story that I'd seen in the theater, and he'd say he'd seen them too. When I'd ask who he went with, he'd always say, "Oh, I went by myself." Even as a kid, I thought it was strange. An old man going alone to children's movies. When I was about 10, my grandmother, his wife, passed away. A few months later, my mom sat my brother and me down and told us something she'd kept from us for years. My grandfather had had an affair before I was born, and from that affair came a child, a boy. My mom told us that my grandfather had confessed this after my grandmother's death because it was her final wish that the truth be known. Here's the part that makes it even crazier. Apparently, when I was around 3 or 4, I almost exposed the secret without realizing it. I was at a park with my other grandmother, my dad's mom, and my ball rolled away. A boy, a few years older than me, picked it up and handed it back. My grandfather was there and saw the whole thing. That boy was his love child, my uncle, though no one knew it at the time. When my grandfather spotted me talking to him, he panicked, grabbed the boy, and left before my grandmother could approach. Looking back, that was the moment everything almost came out years earlier. It remains one of the darkest family secrets ever revealed. The day I unknowingly met my uncle, my grandfather's secret son. Story 31. My cousin turned out to be a lot more closely related to me than I ever thought. Let me break it down so it's clear. My mom, Jean, has a sister named Tammy. My dad, Bart, has a brother named Sam. My Aunt Tammy was married to another man, whose name doesn't really matter here. She and that man had a son named Brad. Brad and I always looked weirdly similar, not just the usual family resemblance, but close enough that people sometimes said we looked like siblings. I figured it was just because our moms were sisters and shared a lot of features. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. Aunt Tammy had been secretly sleeping with my Uncle Sam, my dad's brother. So Brad isn't just my cousin. He's the child of my mom's sister and my dad's brother, which makes him both my cousin and something genetically closer to a half-sibling. My mom said she knew from the first day she saw baby Brad because he had the same ears and feet as everyone on my dad's side. My dad spent a good month in the doghouse until Tammy finally confessed. It's still one of those family stories no one brings up, but everyone remembers. Story 32. My family's dysfunction runs deep on both sides. My grandmother on my father's side was overly handsy with me and my brother when we were kids. She emotionally manipulated my grandfather for years. He was close to earning a major promotion and benefits in the Navy, but she would threaten sue us if he didn't come home immediately. Eventually, he gave in and left his career behind. She also cut every woman out of my grandpa's old travel photos, even ex-girlfriends he'd had before meeting her. My maternal grandfather, on the other hand, was the kindest man I've ever known. He captained a fishing boat for over 30 years, and even when dementia started setting in, he taught me lessons that shaped who I am, to listen carefully, to be kind, to love deeply, and to nurture relationships. He was everything good that the rest of the family wasn't. My father's mother, the same manipulative grandma, would rant that my other grandfather deserved dementia and that it was somehow my maternal grandmother's fault. My aunt, who seemed fun when we were little, turned out to be just as cruel. She's emotionally abusive toward her husband and daughter, constantly screaming and blaming others for trivial things like a single dirty dish. She used to be a cheerleader and a bully, beating up classmates and laughing about it years later like it was her glory days. Then there's my dad. When my mom broke up with him in high school, he showed up at her house, pounding on the door and yelling until she opened it, not to talk, but to wear her down emotionally. He's lazy, angry, and selfish. He drinks constantly and avoids work unless it's the easiest job possible. When I was a kid, he'd yell at my mom, dragging her into the pantry while forcing my brother and me to blast the TV volume to drown it out. She'd come out later crying, and he'd tell us, "Everything's fine." If I ever asked what happened, he'd get furious and force my mouth open to pour hot sauce on my tongue to teach me a lesson. Now I keep my distance from all of them. My grandmother is dying from kidney failure, and even though my brother and I are blood type matches, we both refused her request for a transplant. My aunt's marriage is falling apart. I can see my uncle leaving her once their daughter finishes high school. My mom's planning to leave my dad once my younger sister graduates too. She makes almost all the family's income, And when she walks away, he'll finally have to face what he spent his whole life running from: himself. Story 33. My partner's family history isn't dark exactly, but it's full of unanswered questions and hidden gaps that have turned into an ongoing investigation. His great-grandmother, B, raised his maternal grandmother, M, alone in the 1930s. M was born in 1929, and the father's identity has never been known. Through searching old records, we discovered that B had actually married a man, R, in the autumn of 1916, a man no one in the family had ever heard of. We can't find R's name in any of the war death records, which means he likely survived World War I. But if that's the case, then what happened in the 15 years between their marriage and the birth of M? Was R M's father, or had B started a new relationship? We managed to track down R's family tree. He was one of 7 boys, all around the right age, who have served in both world wars, and we even found a living nephew in his 80s. But since records in this country aren't released until 100 years after their creation, we'll have to wait until 2018 for any post-war documents, or until 2021 for the 1921 census. By then, the nephew may already have passed away, if he even knows anything at all. It's strange to think how easily entire branches of a family can just disappear into silence. Story 34. My father died in 1989 when I was 28. At his funeral in his hometown in Kentucky, the whole process, viewing to burial, lasted 3 days. There was a small lounge at the funeral home where everyone gathered to smoke, drink coffee, and talk. That's where I spent most of those days with my uncle and older cousins, finally hearing stories no one had ever told me. I was the youngest of my generation, and my father had kept a lot from me. That was when I learned the biggest secret of all, that my maternal grandmother had committed suicide just before World War II. When I was a child, every summer we'd drive from Florida to Kentucky to visit family. Those were some of the happiest memories of my life. Aunts, uncles, cousins, laughter. But no one ever spoke much about my grandmother. It was like she had been erased. At the funeral, they finally told me she'd killed herself by jumping down a well in 1939. It hit me that back then, people didn't understand depression. It was treated as something shameful, not tragic. So they just stopped talking about her altogether. It's unsettling to realize how easily silence can rewrite a family's history. Story 35. My family's history reads like something out of a grim novel. One of my 8th or 9th great-grandfathers, Reverend Roland Taylor, was burned at the stake during Bloody Mary's reign in England, though mercifully a guard killed him with a halberd before the flames reached him. His uncle-in-law, William Tyndale, met the same fate for translating the Bible into English. Fast forward a few centuries, and my 3rd or 4th great-grandmother, a widow living alone in rural Missouri, was murdered with an axe while bringing the cows into the barn one night. Everyone in town knew who did it, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict the killer, so they fled and were never caught. Then there's my grandmother's story. She came from the Pomeranian town of Demmin. When the Soviets advanced through Germany near the end of World War II, mass suicides swept the town. The local pharmacist handed out poison, though it was often too weak, and some people woke up days later in agony. Mothers tied rocks to their babies and walked into the river. The most horrifying story was about a local teacher who, as Soviet troops closed in, killed his own family, fired Panzerfausts at the advancing soldiers, and then hanged himself. My great-grandparents weren't members of the Nazi Party, so instead of taking their own lives, they fled west. Still, every time I think of what happened in Demmin, I can't shake the thought that entire generations were swallowed up by despair, and somehow my family just barely escaped becoming part of it. Story 36. When I was 13, my dad died, and everyone told me it was from hypothermia. They said he'd gotten his truck stuck out in the woods one winter night and froze to death before help could reach him. For years I believed that story, until I learned the truth. My dad had taken his own life. The car dealership where he worked as general manager, one of the largest in the world at the time, and the first to sell cars over the internet, was under federal investigation. It turned out the dealership was being used to smuggle coca from Mexico and distribute it across the northwestern United States. The authorities had wiretaps, including some from our own home, and my dad was the only one they had solid evidence against. Instead of facing prison or betraying his partners, he made the decision to end his life. I didn't want to believe it at first, but in our small town, everyone knew. It's been 12 years now, and I still can't drive past that old dealership without feeling the weight of what he chose to carry alone. Story 37. My grandmother grew up believing she was an only child. Her parents had lost a baby girl to spina bifida before she was born, but aside from that tragedy, her childhood was happy and uneventful, or so she thought. A few years ago, while doing some family history research, she found something that changed everything. 2 birth certificates, a set of twins, a boy and a girl, born to her mother, sharing her rare surname. They'd been adopted immediately after birth. My grandmother would have been too young to remember her mother being pregnant again, and to make things stranger, her father's name wasn't listed on either certificate. After a long search, she managed to track down her twin sister, but learned that her brother had already passed away. The 2 women debated getting a paternity test to confirm what they already suspected, but in the end, they decided to leave it as it was, bound not by blood tests, but by the quiet truth that had finally surfaced after a lifetime of secrets. Story 38. When I was little, maybe 3 years old, I had a vivid memory that stuck with me. I was in the kitchen, barely tall enough to see over the counter. The doorbell rang, and my mom answered it. It was her best friend, the woman who ran my daycare, standing there with a bunch of Tupperware containers. My mom suddenly started screaming and crying at her. I didn't understand why. I thought maybe the woman had stolen the Tupperware, and I remember crying because my mom was so upset. Years later, as a teenager, I asked my mom about it, but she brushed it off. When I brought it up again, she told me to drop it. It wasn't until college that I finally learned what really happened. One night, while drinking with my sisters, I started telling the story. As soon as I mentioned the Tupperware, one of my sisters interrupted and said, "Oh my God, I remember that." They looked at each other and finally decided to tell me the truth. My mom's best friend, the woman from my daycare, had been having an affair with my dad. He would drop my sister off at her house to play with the woman's daughter while he slept with her in the next room. When my mom found out, it broke her. She locked herself in her room for 3 days, playing Fast Car by Tracy Chapman on repeat. My dad moved out for a month, taking my older brother with him. Eventually, my mom let him come back. She forgave him, but she never really recovered. My brother never recovered either. He dropped out of school, got hooked on substances, and went in and out of rehab and jail for years. My mom, the kindest woman I know, carried the pain of being betrayed by both her husband and her best friend in silence. When I finally confronted her as an adult, she said forgiving him was the hardest thing she ever did. I told her she was crazy for doing it, but she just smiled sadly and said, "Sometimes forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you." Story 39. It's not exactly dark, but it's one of those strange full-circle family discoveries that makes you question how small the world really is. My great-grandmother on my mom's dad's side lived in the same house from 1930 until she passed away at 100 years old a few years ago. Back in the 1950s, she used to rent out her attic suite to boarders, students, workers, and the occasional small family looking for a place to stay. She loved talking about the people who passed through her home and even kept photos of some of them. One day while going through old pictures, my family came across one that made everyone stop. It was a woman named Ruth and her husband with a small boy. My great-grandmother had described them as party animals who seemed like they were running from trouble. She remembered that they said they were from a nearby town and had 2 daughters who didn't live with them anymore. Decades later, we realized the truth. That odd little family had been my dad's parents, and the little boy in the picture was my dad. His parents had been hiding from the police in Toronto, where his father had been involved in petty crime and needed to lay low for a while. My dad didn't remember much, only that they moved a lot when he was small, and that his father died when he was around 7 or 8. Somehow, by pure coincidence, his grandmother had unknowingly boarded her future daughter-in-law and son-in-law. Story 40. When my grandmother was alive, no one ever talked about her brother. His name wasn't mentioned at family gatherings, and when I asked about him, everyone went quiet. His grave and the government records only showed that he died at 25. Nothing else. That wasn't unusual for 1910, but the silence around him always felt heavy. Years later, when old newspapers became digitized, I decided to look him up. That's when I found out what really happened. One night he got up, walked out of the family home, and threw himself into the river. He drowned before anyone could find him. The newspaper said he had recently been hospitalized for throat trouble, which I now suspect might have been code for a prior suicide attempt or a related illness. My family were strict Catholics, and back then, suicide was considered a grave sin, something that brought shame to the entire family. I finally understood why no one ever mentioned him. For over a century, his story was buried, literally and figuratively, under the weight of silence and stigma. Story 41, I found out by complete accident that my grandpa on my dad's side wasn't actually my biological grandfather. He was my dad's stepdad. My real grandpa had left the family years before, and the man I grew up calling grandpa was only related to us by marriage. The discovery itself didn't shock me too much since I'd never been close to either of them, but the way I found out still makes me laugh. I was driving home with my mom, chatting casually about family history. I wanted to ask about her father, but for some reason I said, "What about Dad's dad?" She paused and said, "Oh, so you know about that?" I didn't, but instead of admitting my mistake, I just went along with it. She started explaining that my grandpa was actually my dad's stepfather, and that my biological grandpa had left long before I was born. When she asked who told me, I panicked and said, "Oh, Aunt Linda mentioned it once." She nodded, satisfied. To this day, she still has no idea that she was the one who accidentally told me the family secret. Story 42. I never met my first cousin. She was much older than me and lived far away. But the story of what happened to her and her family is one of the most disturbing things I've ever learned. She lived with her elderly mother and her 12-year-old son. From what everyone said, she was a party girl who only showed up to collect her mother's Social Security check and occasionally drop off a little food, usually just a few loaves of bread. The boy got free lunches at school, but his grandmother was often left hungry. Then the grandmother developed a sore on her face that wouldn't heal. My cousin refused to take her to a doctor, and the old woman, struggling with memory problems, didn't realize she could use Medicare. She couldn't afford a taxi or a doctor's visit on her own. That sore turned out to be cancer, and without treatment, it slowly ate away half her face and one of her eyes. Through it all, the 12-year-old boy tried to take care of her alone, while his mother kept cashing the checks. Eventually, the grandmother died from the untreated cancer, and the truth finally came out. The boy was sent to live with other relatives, but by then, the damage had been done. This happened back in the mid-1980s. He's a grown man now, but he's still deeply scarred from what he lived through, and he hates the mother who let it happen. Story 43. My stepmom once discovered her entire identity was built on a lie, by accident, while applying for her marriage license. The state refused to accept her birth certificate because it was missing the official seal. Thinking it was just a clerical issue, she requested a new one. But then the state told her that her records were sealed and she'd have to go to the county office in person. When she did, the truth came out. The certificate she'd always had was a forgery. She wasn't actually the daughter of the woman she thought was her mother. She was the child of our Aunt Pam, who had been unmarried at the time. Back then, it was a huge scandal. Around the same time, my grandmother had also been pregnant, but she miscarried. So to save Pam from shame, my grandmother agreed to take the baby, pretend she had given birth herself, and raise her as her own. On the original birth certificate, Aunt Pam is listed as the mother. The forged one listed my grandmother instead. Somehow the government never noticed, not for decades, until my stepmom tried to get married out of state, and everything unraveled. My grandmother, who orchestrated the whole thing, still doesn't know that we found out. Story 44. So my mom and I are from Russia, and she has been married 3 times. There is a lot to this story, but later on she told me some things about husband number 1, my biological father, being in the mob and getting killed, and that husband number 2 had disappeared and was presumed dead, though she never said whether he was in the mob or not. Now, I personally think husband number 2 is the far more interesting one because he had only one hand. My mom told me he lost it messing around with fireworks, But since she hated them and only gave me that reason when I wanted to participate in the 4th of July, it sounds like a total parent lie. Remembering how oddly wealthy he seemed for being fairly young in Russia, and how he used to bring me back these beautiful dresses from trips to the Netherlands, even though he never particularly liked kids. I was about 4, so it probably was not personal. I can only assume he was involved with substances back then. Why else would a young Russian mobster be going to the Netherlands and buying a child puffy dresses? Also, since we obviously do not celebrate the 4th of July, how many opportunities are there to blow off your hand with fireworks versus being pressured and threatened into having a hand cut off shortly before you disappear and your body is later found? Anyway, she married the man I consider my dad in what now seems like a mail-order bride arrangement. Only obvious to me now. So she and I moved here in 2000, and they have been married, and he has continued not to be murdered so far since then. I still call her the Black Widow, though. Story 45. A couple of years back, I went with 2 friends to take care of their grandfather. He seemed like a kind old man, and as he was dying, he gave me a box of old things he did not want thrown out. When I got home and opened it, it was full of Nazi paraphernalia, war medals, Nazi flags, a photograph of him shaking Adolf Hitler's hand at a rally, and even a full Schutzstaffel officer's uniform. The real kicker was a painting of a German shepherd, apparently done by Hitler himself. This man obviously knew Hitler well and had retained his past as an SS officer. I ended up burning everything. I did not want my friends to learn the truth about their grandfather while he was so close to death. And frankly, it felt easier to try to forget the whole thing. Looking back, I could have made a lot of money selling it all, but the kind of person who would buy that stuff must be pretty distasteful. Story 46. My mom always had serious mental health problems that later led to physical health issues. For a long time, my grandparents housed my mother, my sister, and me until I was about 12. My grandfather was a distant figure. I even joined the United States Marine Corps like he did. We left their house and fell into poverty and squalor. Family life was hell. My mother was a mess, and my sister enabled a lot of it. I am 28 now. My mother passed away a couple of years ago, and shortly after, my sister started pressuring our grandparents for money to pay for a mommy makeover package, breast augmentation, and a tummy tuck. When they refused, she became furious and came to me saying our mother had been abused by our grandfather from age 7 to 17. She claimed he had courted my mother and led her to believe he would leave her mother for her someday. Supposedly, he was a Vietnam War veteran who had also abused her physically, even once slamming her head into a board with a nail in it. My sister said he had raped 2 cousins who stayed with them briefly. I was repulsed and denied it at first, but eventually I believed what I was hearing and decided to cut them out of our lives and any other relatives who knew and did nothing. Our hands were clean. After I supported my sister in that move, she confronted our grandfather and then threatened to cut him off from contact with me, her, and her 2 children unless he paid for the surgery, calling it an advance on her inheritance. She casually told me one day while we were bowling that she was taking the kids to Grandpa for the day and that he agreed to pay. She said if God could forgive him, she could too. I lost my mind, got kicked out of her house, and have not spoken to her or anyone else on that side since, except one cousin who had separated himself earlier for his own reasons. If I ever randomly encounter my grandfather, I do not know what I will do, but I have had several dreams of brutalizing him into a broken heap. He, Mexican, always shamed me for my non-Mexican heritage from my father, and now I curse any genetic traits I got from his line. I have some physical features of his, and it is hard not to hate those parts of myself. I am profoundly disappointed in every person I am related to on that side. It is hard to know you come from that filth and not resent yourself.